The National Basketball Association in the early 1990s was not a place for the faint of heart. It was an era defined by raw power, intimidating tattoos, and reputations forged in the fires of back-alley brawls and courtroom appearances. Fans tuned in to see the bad boys of Detroit and the fierce aggression of New York, yet in the middle of this chaotic landscape stood one man who seemed entirely out of place. David Robinson arrived in the league looking like a statue carved from marble, possessing a smile that appeared too bright for the grit of the professional hardwood. But for the veteran players who had spent years in the trenches, this image of the perfect gentleman was deeply unsettling. They began to whisper that such a flawless persona had to be a calculated performance, a grand public relations stunt designed by the league to offer a clean alternative to the growing darkness of the sport. While other stars were making headlines for late-night incidents and heated exchanges with officials, David Robinson remained a mystery of calm. According to the official league statistical reports for the 1990 to 1991 season, while technical fouls were being handed out like confetti to other marquee players, David Robinson maintained a record of 0 instances of aggressive misconduct. This lack of a temper was seen by some as a lack of competitive fire, but others wondered if something more complex was being suppressed. A prominent 1990 article in Sports Illustrated even posed the question of whether he was simply too good for this world, or if the mask of the naval officer was hiding a human being who was afraid to show his true colors. The investigation into his life begins here, because behind that quiet exterior, there were forces at play that the public was never supposed to see. The pressure to maintain this saintly image was immense, and the stakes were higher than anyone realized. The story of how David Robinson ended up in San Antonio is often told as a simple tale of luck, but the reality buried in the archives of 1987 is far more dramatic. When the Spurs used their first overall pick on the young center, they were not just drafting a player. They were entering into a 2-year period of agonizing uncertainty that nearly crippled the franchise. Because of his commitment to the United States Navy, David Robinson could not step onto an NBA court until 2 years after he was selected. This was a move that many experts at the time called a career-killing gamble for a struggling team. The city of San Antonio was on edge, and the local media archives, specifically the San Antonio Express News from that era, reveal a deep-seated fear that the city's investment would vanish into thin air if the naval officer decided to change his mind. During those 2 years of waiting, something extraordinary was happening behind the closed doors of the military. Official Navy documents from 1983 and 1987 show a biological transformation that sounds more like science fiction than sports history. David Robinson entered the academy at a height of roughly 6 feet 4 inches, or about 193 centimeters, but by the time he completed his service, he had surged to over 7 feet, or 213 centimeters. This growth spurt changed the entire trajectory of his career and his value to the league. However, the most dangerous secret was a loophole in the collective bargaining agreement. If the Spurs had failed to navigate the complex legal paperwork during those 24 months, David Robinson would have had the right to walk away as a free agent, potentially costing the team tens of millions of dollars in future revenue and leaving the city with nothing but a broken dream. The nickname of the Admiral has followed David Robinson for decades, evoking images of a man commanding massive warships on the high seas. However, the reality of his time in uniform was carefully managed to maintain a specific public image while protecting a multi-million-dollar asset. While the promotional videos showed him in full military regalia, his actual duties were centered at the Naval Submarine Base in Kings Bay, Georgia. He was a member of the Civil Engineer Corps, and while his service was honorable, it was far from the front lines of global conflict. Because of his massive frame, he literally could not fit inside a standard submarine, making his presence on a seagoing vessel a physical impossibility. Reports from the base during that time suggest that he was given a specialized schedule that allowed him to maintain his elite athletic conditioning while performing his engineering tasks. The government itself had to intervene to ensure that their most famous recruit could transition into the professional world without a scandal. A formal memorandum from the Secretary of the Navy in 1987 specifically authorized a reduction in his active duty obligation from 5 years down to only 2. This decision sparked intense debate within the halls of the Pentagon, as some officials felt that a special exception was being made for a celebrity athlete that an average citizen would never receive. In the construction reports filed at Kings Bay during the late 80s, the name of Ensign David Robinson appears on various infrastructure projects, a far cry from the glamorous life of a basketball superstar. But as his service neared its conclusion, the focus shifted from engineering to the massive payday that was waiting for him. The transition from a modest military salary to the astronomical wealth of the NBA was about to create a shockwave that would forever change the locker room dynamic in San Antonio. In the autumn of 1989, the atmosphere within the San Antonio Spurs organization was thick with a mixture of desperate hope and simmering resentment. For 2 long years, the franchise had languished in the basement of the league, waiting for their naval savior to complete his service. But when David Robinson finally walked through those locker room doors, he didn't just bring his elite athleticism, he brought a financial weight that threatened to crush the team's internal chemistry. According to the archives of the Players Union and reports from major sports outlets like the New York Times, David Robinson signed a staggering 10-year contract worth $26 million. In an era before the massive salary explosions of the modern day, this was a sum that felt almost offensive to the seasoned veterans who had spent a decade bruising their bodies for a fraction of that amount. The proper young man was suddenly the wealthiest person in the building, and the eyes that watched him from the training tables were not always friendly. The pressure to perform was immediate and suffocating. If he failed to live up to the astronomical price tag, the city of San Antonio might never recover. However, the impact of his arrival was nothing short of a statistical miracle. Official NBA records show that the Spurs underwent the greatest single-season turnaround in the history of the sport at that time, jumping from a dismal 21 wins to an incredible 56 wins in the 1989 to 1990 season. While the fans were chanting his name, the veteran players were left to wonder if they were now just supporting actors in the David Robinson show. This sudden shift in power created a quiet friction that the cameras never captured. Behind the scenes, questions were already being asked about whether a man this polished, this wealthy, and this controlled could ever truly lead a group of hardened warriors into the fires of a championship battle. But the real challenge to his authority wasn't coming from his teammates. It was coming from a global icon who occupied the very top of the mountain. As the 1990s progressed, the league found itself at a crossroads, searching for a face that could balance the raw, often controversial dominance of Michael Jordan. The marketing giants saw in David Robinson the perfect anti-Jordan, a hero who followed the rules, respected authority, and carried himself with a military discipline that appealed to the older, more conservative demographic of the country. This wasn't just about basketball, it was a calculated battle for the soul of the consumer. According to marketing analysis and financial data from Forbes in 1992, the gap between Michael Jordan's endorsement earnings and the rest of the league was a canyon, but David Robinson was one of the few who was being groomed to close it. This created an unspoken rivalry between the two stars, one fought not on the court, but in the boardrooms of multi-billion-dollar corporations. While Michael Jordan was the king of Nike, David Robinson's camp was incredibly selective, often turning down lucrative deals that didn't align with his strictly curated image. Industry insiders from the early 90s recalled a specific incident during a high-budget commercial shoot where David Robinson reportedly halted production to demand changes to a script he felt was slightly too edgy or disrespectful to his values. He wasn't just a player, he was a brand that refused to be tarnished. This rigid adherence to his moral compass made him a darling of the corporate world, but it also painted a target on his back within the league. Other players began to view him as a corporate puppet who was disconnected from the reality of the streets where the game was born. The tension was building, and it was only a matter of time before someone arrived who would go out of their way to tear that polished image to shreds. That person was about to enter his life, and he was the exact opposite of everything the Admiral stood for. The experiment began in 1993, and it remains one of the most baffling decisions in the history of professional sports. The San Antonio Spurs, a team built on the foundation of David Robinson's discipline, decided to trade for the most volatile human being to ever wear a uniform, Dennis Rodman. It was a collision of two completely different universes. On one side, you had David Robinson, a man who began his days with prayer and studied his Bible in the back of the team plane. On the other, you had a man who was increasingly famous for his late-night excursions to Las Vegas, his evolving hair colors, and his blatant disregard for team rules. In his own words, documented in the autobiography titled "Bad as I Want to Be," Dennis Rodman described his time in San Antonio as a period of intense frustration, claiming that David Robinson's leadership was too soft and lacked the killer instinct needed to win at the highest level. The internal conflict was a nightmare for the coaching staff. While David Robinson was trying to lead by example, Dennis Rodman was busy racking up a record number of fines for conduct detrimental to the team. Club records from the 1993 to 1994 season indicate that the organization issued tens of thousands of dollars in penalties to Dennis Rodman for everything from missed practices to public insubordination. The Admiral found himself in the impossible position of trying to save a teammate who had no interest in being rescued. They were the most talented defensive duo in the league, but they barely spoke to one another. The psychological warfare in the locker room was reaching a breaking point, and many wondered if David Robinson would finally break his code of silence and lash out. Instead, he channeled that frustration into a single game that would become one of the most controversial performances in the history of the sport. On the final day of the 1994 regular season, the world of basketball witnessed something that felt less like a sporting achievement and more like a carefully orchestrated heist. April 24, 1994, is a date that remains etched in the memory of every purist who believes in the sanctity of the game, but for all the wrong reasons. David Robinson was locked in a bitter struggle with a young powerhouse center named Shaquille O'Neal for the prestigious scoring title. What happened in Los Angeles that night against the Clippers was so blatant that it sent shockwaves through the league office. The Spurs were not just playing to win, they were playing as if they were on a mission to inflate a single man's ego at any cost. Every offensive possession was funneled to David Robinson, regardless of the tactical situation, while his teammates bypassed open shots to ensure the Admiral could reach his target. The statistical protocol for that evening shows that David Robinson poured in a staggering 71 points, a number that would normally be celebrated as a historic milestone. However, the atmosphere surrounding the performance was tainted with the scent of a backroom deal. In the post-game reports from various sports media outlets and an incredibly revealing interview with the Clippers coach at the time, Bob Weiss, there were heavy hints that the game had lost all competitive integrity. Bob Weiss openly questioned the tactics used by the Spurs, suggesting that the effort to force-feed David Robinson the ball was unlike anything he had seen in his professional career. Shaquille O'Neal was reportedly furious, viewing the 71 points as a manufactured achievement rather than an earned honor. This moment of immense statistical glory actually began to erode the respect David Robinson held among his peers. The basketball world began to wonder if his focus had shifted from winning titles to collecting individual accolades through questionable means. But the universe has a way of balancing the scales, and the very next year, the Admiral would face a reckoning that would be broadcast to millions. The 1995 Western Conference Finals should have been the crowning moment of David Robinson's career. He had just been named the most valuable player of the league, a title that officially recognized him as the greatest player on the planet at that moment. The scene was set for a glorious celebration in front of his home fans in San Antonio. Before the tip-off of Game 2, the league commissioner stood at center court to present David Robinson with the trophy, a gleaming symbol of his dominance. But standing just a few feet away was Hakeem Olajuwon, the leader of the Houston Rockets, who watched the ceremony with a quiet, lethal intensity. What followed over the next several hours was a systematic dismantling of a superstar that felt less like a basketball game and more like a public interrogation of a man's soul. Hakeem Olajuwon proceeded to take the newly crowned MVP to school, using a series of hypnotic footwork moves and fakes that left David Robinson looking completely lost on his own court. The statistical contrast was devastating. According to the official box scores from that series, Hakeem Olajuwon averaged more than 35 points per game, while the Admiral was held to just 23. Every time David Robinson tried to assert his authority, he was met with a dream shake that made the best defender in the league look like a confused amateur. The whispers of softness that had followed him for years suddenly became a deafening roar in the press. Fans and analysts began to label him a paper tiger, a man who looked the part but lacked the heart to survive a street fight. This nationally televised disaster wasn't just a loss. It was a total collapse of the myth he had built. In the aftermath of this defeat, David Robinson didn't just go into hiding. He underwent a profound internal change that left many in the league wondering if he had joined a radical spiritual group. While the public saw a man who was simply dedicated to his craft, those close to the San Antonio locker room knew that something fundamental had shifted within David Robinson during the summer of 1991. In June of that year, the Admiral announced that he had become born again, a transition that many in the hyper-masculine world of professional sports found deeply suspicious. This wasn't just about attending a Sunday service. It was a radical realignment of his priorities that some coaches feared would destroy his competitive edge. In an extensive and rare interview with the publication Christianity Today, David Robinson detailed a moment of clarity where he realized that the pursuit of basketball glory was an empty vessel. He began to spend hours in deep study and prayer, sometimes even inviting teammates to join him in sessions that felt more like a revival meeting than a team briefing. This newfound devotion created an immediate friction with the coaching staff and the front office. There were quiet reports of tension during training camps, where David Robinson allegedly refused to engage in the dirty tactics that often define a winning team. He no longer wanted to be the predator on the court, and some insiders believed his radical faith was making him too compassionate toward his opponents. Tax records and public filings from the early 90s also began to show a massive diversion of his wealth into various religious foundations, leading to rumors that he was being influenced by charismatic leaders who were more interested in his bank account than his spirit. Was this a genuine quest for peace, or was it a convenient excuse for a man who realized he couldn't handle the brutal pressure of being the league's primary target? As the '96 season approached, this spiritual path would be put to the ultimate test when a catastrophic injury threatened to end his career, leading to what many call the greatest conspiracy in the history of the draft. The season of 1996 to 1997 remains a dark stain on the history of the league for some, and a masterstroke of manipulation for others. After years of being a perennial contender, the San Antonio Spurs suddenly collapsed into a state of total dysfunction. The official narrative was that David Robinson had suffered a devastating back injury, followed by a broken foot, forcing the superstar to remain on the sidelines. However, the sheer timing of this absence led many to suspect a deep-seated conspiracy within the organization. During that entire calendar year, David Robinson appeared in only 6 games, leaving the team to drift into the abyss of the standings without its captain. To the outside observer, it looked like a catastrophic run of bad luck, but to the skeptics, it looked like a calculated retreat to secure a future that no one saw coming. The results of this mysterious absence were staggering. The Spurs finished the season with 62 losses, a number so high it felt statistically impossible for a team with such recent success. This massive failure placed them directly in the path of the #1 overall pick in the 1997 draft lottery. In a moment that was broadcast live to a skeptical audience, the Spurs defied the odds and won the right to select the most coveted prospect in a generation, Tim Duncan. The coincidence was too perfect for many to ignore. Investigative journalists and rival executives began to whisper that the injury to David Robinson was exaggerated or prolonged to ensure the team could tank its way to a dynasty. While the league office officially cleared the team of any wrongdoing, the stench of a backroom deal hung heavy in the air. This miracle in the lottery would change the course of sports history, but it also forced the Admiral to face a terrifying reality. A younger, stronger lion was entering his territory, and the world was waiting for the inevitable clash of egos. When Tim Duncan arrived in San Antonio, the basketball world held its breath, expecting a collision of massive personalities that would tear the locker room apart. History is littered with examples of aging superstars who refused to give up their status, resulting in bitter feuds and ruined seasons. However, what happened between David Robinson and the young rookie was a total departure from the norm, leaving analysts and psychologists baffled. Instead of protecting his territory, the Admiral did something that few men in his position have ever dared to do. He stepped back. He voluntarily surrendered his role as the primary offensive weapon, transitioning into a supportive position that allowed the newcomer to flourish. This wasn't just a tactical change, it was a complete psychological overhaul of a franchise that had belonged to one man for nearly a decade. The shift was clearly visible in the data from that era. Official box scores show that David Robinson's field goal attempts and scoring average dropped by nearly 30% as he focused on defense and rebounding to pave the way for his successor. In a series of candid interviews, the head coach, Greg Popovich, marveled at the lack of ego displayed by his veteran leader, but some wondered if this was a genuine act of humility or a calculated survival strategy. By becoming the ultimate mentor, David Robinson ensured he would remain relevant and protected while someone else carried the heavy burden of expectation. This Twin Towers partnership was marketed as a selfless brotherhood, but behind the scenes, it was a high-stakes experiment in team dynamics. As they began to dominate the league, a new question emerged from the shadows. While the Admiral was busy winning titles, his financial maneuvers were reaching a level of complexity that began to attract the attention of expert observers. In the early 2000s, while most athletes were spending their millions on sprawling mansions and fleets of luxury vehicles, David Robinson made a move that left the financial world stunned. He signed a personal check for the astronomical sum of $11.5 million to found a school known as the Carver Academy. On the surface, it was a breathtaking act of charity, the largest single donation ever made by an active professional athlete at that time. The public was presented with the image of a selfless hero investing in the future of underprivileged children, but a closer look at the timing and the structure of the gift suggested a more intricate story. In the high-stakes world of elite taxation, such a massive transfer of wealth can often serve as a powerful tool to manage a person's public profile and private liabilities simultaneously. According to tax filings and public records from 2001, the foundation of this academy allowed for significant financial maneuvering within the unique legal landscape of the state of Texas. While no one could deny the positive impact on the students, investigators and financial skeptics began to look into the governance of the funds. Was this truly a pure act of faith, as the Admiral claimed, or was it a sophisticated way to shield his massive career earnings from the reach of the government as his playing days neared their conclusion? The school became a cornerstone of his brand, a physical monument to his perfection that was immune to the criticisms of the sports world. Even as he was being hailed as a saint of the city, the sheer scale of the money involved created a sense of mystery that persists to this day. He was building an empire that extended far beyond the basketball court, but the final test of his athletic legacy was still waiting for him in a season that many thought would never count. The year of 1999 is often remembered as a time of celebration in San Antonio, but for the rest of the basketball world, it was a season shrouded in controversy and bitter debate. A brutal labor dispute between the players and the owners had paralyzed the league, leading to a lockout that nearly canceled the entire year. When the dust finally settled, only 50 games remained on the schedule, creating a frantic, condensed atmosphere that many veterans found physically exhausting. David Robinson and the Spurs navigated this chaos with a military-like efficiency, but their path to the trophy was immediately met with skepticism from the highest levels of the sport. The legendary coach Phil Jackson famously stated that any championship won during such a fractured year should be marked with an asterisk in the history books, suggesting the achievement was somehow less valid than a traditional title. The investigative lens on this season reveals a team that took advantage of a weakened league to secure their first taste of gold. In the final series against the New York Knicks, the Spurs faced a team that was missing its own star center and was hobbled by injuries. According to the official game logs from June of 1999, the Spurs capitalized on this imbalance, using the overwhelming size of David Robinson and Tim Duncan to smother their opponents. The final score of the deciding game, a grinding 78-77 victory, reflected the ugly, defensive nature of that era. While the parade in Texas was massive, the whispers in the sports media archives from that month suggest that many viewed David Robinson's first ring as a product of circumstance rather than a true conquest of the league's elite. The Admiral finally had his hardware, but the question of whether he could win a real full season still hung over his head like a dark cloud. By the time the season of 2002 to 2003 arrived, the physical toll of a decade and a half in the trenches was clearly visible on the face of David Robinson. Every movement on the court seemed to be a battle against his own body, as chronic back issues and aging joints threatened to end his career before he could secure one last triumph. The Admiral had already announced that this would be his final journey, and the entire league watched as he transformed into a veteran figurehead for a team that was now firmly led by the younger generation. It was a period of intense emotional contrast. The city was preparing for a goodbye to its greatest icon, while the player himself was struggling just to stay on his feet for 20 minutes a night. The climax of this journey occurred on June 15, 2003, during the sixth game of the finals against the New Jersey Nets. In a performance that silenced his remaining critics, David Robinson summoned a final burst of energy that seemed to defy the laws of biology. The official statistical report for that evening shows that he contributed 13 points and a massive 17 rebounds, a display of dominance that reminded everyone why he was once the most feared player in the world. As the final buzzer sounded and the confetti began to fall, the camera caught a rare sight. A man known for his unshakable naval discipline was reduced to tears on the hardwood. It was the end of an era, but as he walked into the tunnel for the last time, he wasn't just leaving a game. He was moving into a world of high finance and shadows where his next moves would be even more lucrative and far more private. When the jersey of David Robinson was hoisted to the rafters, many assumed he would fade into a quiet life of golf and charity work. Instead, the former naval officer applied his tactical mind to the world of private equity and real estate, building a business fortress that remains largely invisible to the average fan. He co-founded a firm known as Admiral Capital Group, a move that signaled his intent to become a major player in the corporate landscape. Working alongside a former investment banker named Daniel Basikas, David Robinson began to acquire a vast portfolio of assets that stretches across the entire country. This wasn't just a hobby for a retired athlete. It was a sophisticated financial operation that sought to compete with the giants of Wall Street. According to business filings and investment reports from the last decade, the firm managed assets valued at well over $100 million, focusing on everything from luxury hotels to massive office complexes. What makes this empire particularly intriguing is the level of secrecy that surrounds many of its major transactions. While other former stars are constantly seeking the spotlight, David Robinson has chosen to operate in the quiet corridors of power, often partnering with massive institutions like United Services Automobile Association to fund his ventures. The investigation into his post-basketball life reveals a man who has mastered the art of the clean corporate image while navigating the shark-infested waters of the high-stakes real estate market. He has successfully transitioned from a basketball hero to a tycoon, but the mystery remains. Is he truly the saintly figure the media portrays, or is he simply the most effective strategist to ever play the game? As we look back at the incredible journey of David Robinson, a haunting question remains that continues to spark debate in the dimly lit corners of sports bars and executive boardrooms alike. Why is it that a man with his physical gifts, his impeccable record, and his mountain of trophies is so often overshadowed by the louder, more aggressive icons of his era? When the league celebrated its golden anniversary in 1996, and again when it named the 75 greatest players of all time in 2021, the name of David Robinson was always present, yet it never seemed to carry the same electric charge as the name of Michael Jordan. The investigative truth is that the Admiral made a conscious choice to be a different kind of hero, one that the modern media machine often finds too boring to celebrate. He refused to participate in the manufactured drama and the public meltdowns that fuel the 24-hour news cycle, opting instead for a path of quiet, calculated excellence. The quiet rivalry with Michael Jordan wasn't about who could score more points. It was about two different philosophies of life. While Michael Jordan became a global deity through a relentless, often abrasive pursuit of dominance, David Robinson sought to prove that a man could reach the pinnacle of the sport without losing his soul in the process. In one of his most revealing reflections near the end of his journey, he suggested that his only regret was not the missed shots or the lost games, but the moments where the pressure of his perfect image prevented him from being truly seen by the fans. He was a man who lived his life as a meticulous investigation into the limits of human character. Was his flawless reputation a burden that kept him from becoming a cultural phenomenon, or was it his greatest achievement? As the sun sets on the era of the 1990s, we are left with the image of a naval officer who stood tall in a world of chaos, leaving us to wonder if we will ever see his like again. The story of the Admiral is a reminder that the most powerful secrets aren't always found in scandals, but in the quiet strength of a man who refused to break.